muscle is a matter of life and death. Muscle is actually integral to our metabolic health, to bone health, even to heart health, because more muscle helps increase the levels of good cholesterol. It's integral to cardiovascular health because more muscle increases aerobic capacity. And most surprising to a lot of people, it's integral to mental health. And all of the contractions of muscle that we make when we're working out generate molecules called myokines that modulate the function of all the organ systems in our body. So the choice of whether to lift weights, whether to work to make your muscles stronger, is something that really has existential stakes.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, The Untold Story of Muscle in Our Lives with Michael Joseph Gross. It's great to have you here. My name is Guy Raz. I am the host and creator of a bunch of podcasts, including How I Built This and a kids show called Wow in the World. So joining me tonight is Michael Joseph Gross, author of Stronger, The Untold Story of Muscle in Our Lives. Michael's a longtime contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He's written about culture, politics, religion, crime, business, Kelly Clarkson, as I just discovered backstage, technology, national security, and has been featured across national TV and radio programs. Michael, welcome to San Francisco. Welcome to my home.
Thank you for having me.
It's great having you here. I want to start, if you would indulge us for a moment, about how we first met, because we actually met about a decade ago. It was 2014. It was an outdoor conference / music festival. I don't want to call it weird because we are being recorded and you might see it, but it was weird. It was on a mountain in Utah. We were both there to lead discussion sessions, me about politics, you about, I remember you were introduced to me as a Vanity Fair reporter, writer who focused on national security information technology, which is how I thought of you. I think the two of us were among the few people at this conference who were not getting stoned or whatever else was going on there. We were like actually boring and serious. But we managed to have a couple of really great conversations. And then we kind of lost touch for a while. And then we got back in touch in the last year. And I was hoping you could pick up this story.
So when we were at this conference, I had finished the panel discussion that I was moderating, talking to people about tech and national security, which was a topic that I was really enjoying working on, but also led to some dark and twisty places. And because of that, I had decided that I needed to get out of my head and into my body a little bit more, learn to do something that scared me. I decided to learn whitewater kayaking. And I knew I had to get stronger to handle myself on the river, so I started lifting in a more serious way. Anyway, back to the conference. I finished the discussion about tech, and somebody walks up to me and says, when in the last year have you been happiest? It was an icebreaker question that had been assigned randomly to people to meet strangers. And I was just not in the moment where I wanted to be asked when I'd been happiest. But I slowed myself down for a minute, and I knew, like with absolute certainty, I was happiest as I was entering the last wave run on the last day of kayaking school. And I thought, if you know so clearly what makes you happiest and you're not using your best talents to explore that, then what are you doing with your life? So that...
Which is remarkable because you were outwardly, everybody would say, look, this is a very successful journalist, writer, author, focusing on a really hot topic.
Right. And so when I came back and said to my agent and my editor, party's over with all that, basically. They said, okay, we'll see how this works. And I spent a long time. I spent like 6 months writing a proposal for this big book about exercise. And it sold. As I started to get into it, I was looking at all types of exercise, but the research on weight training, on resistance exercise, was just so compelling. It's the type of exercise that the fewest people do, that the most people would get the most out of with the least effort if they tried. And so I decided that really had to be the focus.
So this really, I mean, it was remarkable because this sort of life-changing moment happens 10 years ago.
Right.
Completely shifts your focus, and you start getting into exercise and then decide you want to write a book about it, which of course we are all here to learn more about, discuss. 8 years ago, I think you started this quest, right?
Yeah.
To kind of understand the role of muscle in our lives. I want to get right to the heart of what you found. If you had to boil it down to one sentence, right? This is the part of the title of the book. What is the untold story of muscle in our lives?
Muscle is a matter of life and death. And I guess then if I had to build that out, I would say most of us have grown up with an idea about muscle that's pretty limited and limiting. I think most of us have grown up thinking it's mainly a matter of appearance. When we think about its purpose, we think about it moving us, and for athletes, it helping them play sports better. But muscle is actually integral to our metabolic health, to bone health, even to heart health, because more muscle helps increase the levels of good cholesterol. It's integral to cardiovascular health because more muscle increases aerobic capacity. And most surprising to a lot of people, it's integral to mental health. And all of the contractions of muscle that we make when we're working out generate molecules called myokines that modulate the function of all the organ systems in our body. So the choice of whether to lift weights, whether to work to make your muscles stronger, is something that really has existential stakes.
You clearly started to go down a rabbit hole, right? Because what you're talking about is still really new and radical. Like it hasn't penetrated the mainstream. We're going to talk about that, right? Like why as a culture we don't know these things about muscle. We know about cardiovascular health and about diet and exercise, of course, but what you're talking about is quite simply radical. It's a sort of radical way to think about something. But you started to really look into the scientific research. And where did you sort of see the story of muscle as a matter of life and death first emerging? When did it begin?
The story of muscle as a matter of life and death starts emerging long before we even have an idea that muscles have any function at all. I mean, let's go all the way back to ancient Greece, go all the way back to the start of ancient Greek athletics, to the extent that we can reconstruct that moment. Athletics is actually older than scientific medicine. And ancient Greek athletes were training their muscles to make them bigger and stronger so that they could win victories in athletic competitions. Because athletic competitions were an affirmation of life. They were a part of ancient Greek religious rituals. And I think the easiest way to explain that is to give you an example of the first ancient Greek athletic competition at Olympia, which is the most sacred site. The original Olympic event, as far as we know, was called the Stadion. It's the forerunner to the 200-meter race that we have today. And it started at one
altar, right? I think.
Yes, it started in an altar to a hero, which was a hero in ancient Greek culture is a human who is partly descended from other humans and partly descended from gods. So the athletes are standing at the altar of the hero, and they're looking at the altar to the god, the altar to the greatest god, Zeus. There's been a sacrifice of bulls, and the fleshiest part of the bull, the big meaty thighs, are laid out, ready to be burned, cooked, so that there will be a feast. You've got a priest of Zeus standing next to that altar, and he's holding the torch. When he raises the torch, all the athletes start running, and they just cross those 200 meters as fast as they can because they want to be the first one to get to the torch so that they can take it from the priest and light the altar, start the sacrifice, and open up the channel of thanks between the community and the god. This is a really different kind of athletic victory than I think we often experience today. The athlete is completing the sacrifice on behalf of the community to give to the god so that everybody in the community can be involved in the feast. So victory is not victory over those other guys who didn't run as fast. Victory is, it's really victory over death.
Yeah.
Because the athletes are reenacting the heroes' stories of...
In real time, yeah.
Yes. The heroes' stories of with life and death stakes.
You know, you said something interesting. You said they developed muscles because they must have intuitively known that it helped them perform better. But at the same time, in the book, you talk about how ignorant the ancient Greeks were about what muscles did. I mean, did they not understand that there was a connection between more muscle mass and greater strength? I mean, how did they even understand strength?
So they didn't actually understand that muscle had any function at all. They didn't. They were running these races for hundreds of years before anyone even guessed that muscles had something to do with movement. They thought that muscles were just padding or insulation.
Oh, wow.
And
but did they understand that they could actually develop them? They could grow them by exerting force and using, doing difficult things and lifting rocks or whatever it was?
We don't really know the answer to that question, but the best speculation is that they believed the increasing size of muscle may have been like a thermal
just like an insulation device to keep them warm or whatever, or to protect them if they fell or if they were hit by an animal or in battle.
They believed that motion. So let's just get to Aristotle.
Yeah.
Aristotle believes that motion starts in the heart, that we all have this hot gas that's trapped inside us, basically just hot air that's trapped inside us at birth. It's called pneuma. Pneuma, where we get pneumatic, breath. Pneuma gets hotter and colder as we move toward or away from things that are good for us. Huh. As it gets hotter, it makes the sinews inside our heart swell. When those swell, they attach to other sinews that come out and connect to all of our bones and move us like marionettes. So it's this heat that expands things and expands the flesh that they seem to believe what we see as muscles were. But they didn't even refer to these masses of flesh by the one word they had for specific muscles, which was mus. They referred to these masses of flesh with a general word, sarx, which just meant this padded quality of the body.
Where sarcomeres, I imagine, comes from, possibly,
Huh.
right? The sarcomeres
Yes,
in our
absolutely.
muscles, yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, last night I went down a rabbit hole of looking at ancient Greek statues, and of course, that many of them left because
Right.
most of them are destroyed, and we know about Venus de Milo. And there's a famous one, which is Discobolus. And I think the one that's on display in Rome or wherever it is a reproduction from the 1st century, but it is a Greek statue of a guy with a discus. And you see the muscle tone. I mean, you see what I think from a modern perspective seems like the worship of the human body. And of course, I don't know if that's how they saw it, but you would see that and think, well, muscle was really important to them.
Okay, there's a kind of figure ground illusion happening here. You know those pictures where you can either see a vase or you can see two faces,
Yeah.
but you can't see both at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay, you are seeing the vase when you look at that guy and see muscles. But if I had an ancient Greek here and I had him look at it, he'd be seeing two faces, because it wouldn't be the masses of muscle that would catch his eye. It would be the lines of articulation around them, and especially the joints.
The knees.
And yes, the
Right? They were
knees
focused on
most
knees.
of all. It was tension around the knee joint that was the seat of strength and even paternity and force. So when in Homer, in the Iliad, one warrior kills another, some people translate that he unstrung his knees.
Huh.
Life is tension
Yeah.
for Homer and for the Greeks, and death is the relaxation of that tension.
I mean, they were onto something because, right? I mean, our legs are also the core. I mean, it's part of what makes us strong. Certainly strong leg joints and knees. We can talk about the ancient Greeks for the next 2 hours. But you know, I mean, they must have. You know, I wonder. You know, if they didn't really know or didn't think about it, and I think there's sort of, maybe it's this kind of padding, maybe it's, you know, insulation. When does this start to change? I mean, does it ever start to change in ancient Greece, or do we have to wait for history to kind of just keep puttering along for this perspective to start to shift?
In ancient Rome, Galen of Pergamon, who is really the most famous medical doctor in history, by this point, he's figured out that it's really the brain that's directing movement. It's not the heart. He's just left Aristotle
Do we know if
in the dust.
if he has done autopsies? Has he opened up bodies?
He has opened up bodies of monkeys and pigs, but not people.
Right, okay.
There was a period a few hundred years before him when doctors in Alexandria were able to open up people, and they found out a few things, but it was really Galen who comes up with the insight of the connection between nerves and muscle, but more tendon.
Yeah.
Still, for Galen, the fleshy part of a muscle was just like a factory that was creating the tendon, and the tendon, which was still receiving the pneuma that Aristotle believed in, that's how movement was happening.
So the muscle was just meat. It didn't serve a function.
It was just meat, and not only did it not serve a function, but it would wear you down. It would make you, it would smother your soul. It would make it impossible for you to think. And it could even suffocate you. I mean, this is rhetoric that Galen cooked up to build himself and other doctors up in a professional turf war with athletic trainers.
These are the trainers who are training like the gladiators, or
The students, the elite students
Right.
in gymnasium schools of Rome. So gymnasium schools start with Plato and Aristotle, but even, which is classical Greece,
Yep.
3rd, 4th century BC. Galen is 2nd century AD. Greece by now is a colony of Rome, but it's the most prestigious colony imaginable. Schools in ancient Rome, the elite young men are being trained in the Greek tradition, speaking ancient Greek as if a high school today, everyone were speaking Middle English.
Yeah.
Okay? But it's important. The care of the body is important in this vision of education. But there are two kinds of professionals who can oversee the care of the body: doctors on the one hand and trainers on the other.
And there was a rivalry or a tension.
That's right, because who's going to get to corner the market on what we now call healthcare? Galen happens to be the smartest, kind of the nastiest debater, and he comes up with all of these arguments about muscle that frame it as something that holds people back and holds people down in order to build himself up. It's Galen's idea that muscle smothers the soul and makes it impossible to think, that really bakes in the idea of brain versus brawn. In our culture.
And this is really the beginning of this idea that, and I think even I don't know if it's a Roman word, but there's the term thick that is still used in certain English-speaking countries to mean stupid.
That's right.
Right? It comes from this time period.
It goes actually all the way back to Plato, who in the Timaeus talks about thick flesh. Plato in the Timaeus says that thick flesh covers the least important parts of the body.
Right.
And so people who have more of it are stupid.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So Galen, obviously, one of the most important figures in the ancient world, but still, what we know at this time is still, we're centuries away from really beginning to understand the connection between muscle and movement. When does this start to change? When are humans starting to figure out that actually this isn't just meat? This actually serves a functional purpose.
1543, very big year.
1543.
Very big
You're going
year.
from ancient times all the way to the 16th century before we start to understand that.
Yeah, we're kind of thick.
Yeah. Yeah.
1543 is a very big year. Vesalius, who is the kind of rock star of human anatomy, in his Fabrica.
He's in Italy, in Padua.
In Padua,
Yep.
yes, writes that the fleshy part of muscle is the part that moves us. And this is the same year that Copernicus decides that the Earth revolves around the sun.
So you're not really paying attention to what, right? I mean, you're kind of focused on that big deal thing, which is about to create a fissure in the church, right?
Right. Well, and I think, arguably, these are insights of comparable importance, right?
Yeah. But nobody's really paying that much attention to that first.
No, absolutely not. It takes another, 3 centuries before muscle is really recognized by, it's still a pretty small number of doctors, and they're still making muscle play second fiddle to the mind, because muscle in the 18th century, or rather 19th century, when doctors do start to embrace muscle as an instrument of the soul, they begin to place more of an emphasis on care of muscular exercise in education and in medicine. But again, it's always in second place.
I want to go back to the 16th century for a second. So Vesalius, he comes up with this theory that there's a connection between muscle and movement.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really cause that much of a stir, essentially. I mean, clearly it's been written about, it's been done, and we'll get to some of the people who started to write about this stuff, but you come across this as well, and you're reading it, and then it kind of, no one's really paying attention until you're talking about the 19th century in the United Kingdom, in Britain, right? It's British. Are they doctors? This guy George Barker Winship, David Butler, who are they? Are they medical doctors, and what do they start to talk about and write about?
So, in the 1840s, in Germany first, Hermann von Helmholtz performs an experiment where he puts meat in test tubes.
Animal meat.
And he watches it rot.
Hopefully, yeah.
And, and from this, he is able to finally figure out that there's actually no such thing as pneuma. And that is the root of the law of thermodynamics, that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Actually, we get that from muscle research by this very young man in Germany. Around the same time, in the United States, a few doctors are starting to embrace strength training for health. And there's one who really stands out. His name is George Barker Winship.
Oh, this is in the United States, not in the United Kingdom. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Okay, sorry.
He's an undergraduate at Harvard in the 1850s. And basically, he's a little guy, 5'7". I don't think he ever weighed more than 150 pounds in his life.
Yep.
He gets picked on. And so he learns gymnastics so that his bully will leave him alone.
Yeah.
By the end of college, he says he's the strongest man in his class. He goes to Harvard Medical School, and he becomes fascinated with a sort of heavy partial deadlift. He creates an apparatus in his backyard, and he builds up to lifting like 1,200 pounds. He begins to feel that this is changing him. It's making him less depressed. It's making his digestion better. And so he starts to apply this heavy lifting using the apparatus in his medical office to treat both men and women and quite elite Bostonians in the mid-19th century. And he's not the only one. There's an entrepreneur named David Butler who comes up with a very similar machine.
Also in Boston?
He, I believe, is New York based. Mm-hmm. By 1871, he has 5 health lift parlors.
In New York?
In New York.
Health clubs?
4 of them on Broadway.
These are must be the first health clubs in the United States.
They've got pianos, grand pianos instead of DJs.
And what do you do inside that club? What do you do when you go in?
Yeah, you go in, you sort of adjust your bustle or your coat, and you stand on a machine which has handles, and you bend down just a little bit and pull it up. So it's like a partial deadlift. It's advertised as something that can help make pregnancy more comfortable, make childbirth easier. And the advertisements show on one side a man doing this, and on another side a woman doing it. So we have women doing heavy resistance exercise in the Victorian period, and not just in New York. He's doing it, he is a very smart marketer. He segments the market into a sort of Tony exclusive studio and a low rate studio. He opens these in Boston, Cincinnati, San Francisco, Providence. And it all is catching on, it's building in popularity, and then George Barker Winship, at the age of 42, has a stroke.
Wow. And so people are starting to make the connection that it's possibly connected to his physical activity.
The New York Times says it's absolutely connected to this physical activity, that he, like many athletes, forgot that caution was the parent of safety.
Yeah.
And so people who had been really getting into heavy lifting get scared that it's going to kill
It's
them.
going to kill him, yeah.
And there's such a long history of bad arguments that that's exactly what it's going to do to you.
Right.
But it just feels like the fulfillment of common sense. And it sets back weight training
For
by-
like almost a century, or half a century, right? Or
Yeah.
I want to get to that in a second, but I want to double click on this for a moment because I'm curious when David Butler is opening these gyms, right? What is the value proposition in the 1870s? I mean, do people understand that this is good for you? I mean, they were like, people would go to, they would go to like health, they go to like Carlsbad and, Czech, the Bohemia, and they'd go to these spa towns, to sit in hot water and breathe fresh air. But did they understand that physical movement, physical exertion was good for you? Was that widely understood in 1850, 60, 70?
Yes, and the reason that, their understanding was that physical exertion was a practice in exertion of the will. Mm-hmm. It goes back to this idea that our intention is always what determines our strength.
And what did weightlifting look like? You talk about this contraption, but was there a bar with weights? Were there dumbbells? Are we talking, or is that going to come much later?
No, there were dumbbells. George Barker Winship actually patented the first plate-loaded dumbbell, and he sold it for, I can't remember the number, but it was the equivalent of a month's salary for a private in the Union Army in the 1860s. It was expensive stuff, but people wanted this. It was chic.
So wouldn't it have been out of the ordinary to go to one of these health clubs, whatever they were? They weren't called health clubs. They were called
Health lift parlors.
So it wouldn't be unusual to walk in and see some guy like doing curls, or would that have? It still must have been unusual, right? Or was it? Yeah.
Unusual in the sense that this was still an elite
Yes, right.
occupation.
These were first adopters.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So like the first gymnastics boosters in Boston were people like the founder of Mass General Hospital, the governor of Massachusetts, the early adopters there, and in Dublin and in London and the other places we know about were all leading citizens.
And there was clearly, there was, some of this was happening also in Germany, I think, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It really started in Germany. Germany was the place where in the 18th century, the gymnastic educational system from ancient Rome was, an idealized version of it was recreated. So in order to build the German Republic, they took ideas from ancient Greece and Rome, like making heavy exercise outdoors a central part of the curriculum. And that was probably the first time that had been done in European schools since antiquity.
All right, so George Barker Winship, he dies at 42.
I believe so.
And I think his tagline was "Strength is health."
Yes.
So this was shocking for people who were like, wait a minute, this guru, right, is starting to have a bit of a following, probably.
Right.
He dies.
Right.
And that just kind of puts an end to this emerging trend of weightlifting for a while, or kind of, maybe not end, but severely tamps it down.
It gives everybody, it turns the great example of strength as health into a cautionary tale.
Wow. And so what, people just say, don't do that? Literally are saying, don't do this, it's not good for you?
Or do this only at low intensity, do this, lift light weights, not heavy weights.
And this is more or less what happens all the way into the pre-Second World War period, right? Around that time, right? There's a guy that you talk about, another American guy named Thomas DeLorme.
Well, so there are a small number of people who continue
Yes.
to lift heavy weights. There are barbell manufacturers
Right.
here in the United States. There are muscle magazines.
Right, with this old photos of the guy with the mustache, holding the weight, right, in the suit. Like, we know what those look like.
Right, right. So it's a subculture that keeps chugging along. In the 1930s, a new muscle magazine starts publication, and it actually uses George Barker Winship's tagline,
Oh, wow. Strength is health.
strength and health.
Strength and health.
Slight change there.
Is it called Muscle Magazine or?
No, it's called Strength and
Strength
Health.
and Health. Oh, I see. The magazines. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I see.
But there's a kid in Birmingham, Alabama, named Thomas Lanier DeLorme, and he comes down with rheumatic fever, which is a bacterial infection believed to weaken the heart. Doctors tell him that he can't get out of bed for 4 whole months. And so he lays there and he reads this brand new magazine, and it's full of stories about what happens if you start lifting heavy weights, and he gets really excited. So once the doctors give him clearance to get out of bed, he starts going to junkyards and looking around for parts. He gets axles and wheels from trains, and he builds himself a barbell, and he starts lifting it, and he makes himself strong.
He's doing squats, presses, like the things again, did people know what to do, how to do them properly? He's looking at the magazines and trying to figure it out?
There is a consciousness of form that doesn't really come close to the detailed consciousness of it that we have now.
Yeah.
But yes, there is discussion in these publications of those things.
So he starts doing this basically in his backyard.
That's right. There are advice columns in these magazines. How many reps should I do? How many sets?
Right.
How should I figure out what weight to lift? So he's just reading all of that and soaking it up. And he decides eventually to become a doctor. And
By the way, he recovers from this infection.
that's right.
And he sees, or he just feels some results from having done the weight training.
Oh, he's not the only one who sees and feels them. He starts putting on halftime shows at the University of Alabama, raising up the backsides of pickup trucks.
So he's like a muscle guy. He's becoming known as like a He-Man.
Oh yeah, he sets regional Olympic weightlifting records.
Oh, wow.
They call him Bama's Hercules.
Okay.
And then he decides to become a doctor. And 1944, end of World War II, there are a lot of soldiers being flown home with broken bones. He's in the orthopedic section at an army hospital, and nobody's getting better fast enough, and more soldiers are coming in all the time. So how can they clear out the beds?
Because the protocol is probably rest. Just stay in the bed.
The standard practice in physical therapy at this time is that a muscle should never be worked beyond the point of moderate fatigue. And so, of course, nobody's getting better.
Yeah.
Thomas DeLorme finds another patient who has experience with lifting weights, and he says, can we try something? Can we try, now that you've come out of surgery, you lifting heavy weights, testing his strength to see what's the most he can lift for 10 repetitions, what's the most he can lift for 1 repetition, then taking about 80% of that and working at that level of intensity. This guy says yes. They do an experiment with an N of 1. It works. He expands that in that hospital. It works. the whole U.S. Army system adopts this technique. It works. And so then he starts testing it on women and adolescents and people with polio. And it turns out that every kind of person he does this repetition maximum strength testing on, and then lifting heavy resistance exercises, it works for all of them.
And does he publish this?
He publishes this in the most reputable medical journals. And
is it revelatory? It must have been, right?
it is, absolutely. The Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the leading doctors in the treatment of polio, declares that this is actually the most effective treatment for people who have had this disease that he's ever seen.
Wow.
But there is a problem. His early publications refer to the technique as heavy resistance exercises. And a lot of doctors just don't like the sound of that. And when they hear that, all they can think of is these people who are called bodybuilders. And they are, as Delorme writes when he's writing about this struggle, they are repulsed by muscle. So there's still this ancient prejudice against muscle in medicine that is holding back this technique from catching on. And Delorme realizes he's just got a branding problem. You know, he's got to fix this. He's got to come up with a new name. So he has a conversation with his wife one night, and she suggests the name progressive resistance exercise. Now, the shift there is a shift from challenge, heavy resistance, to invitation, progressive resistance. It eases you along. And once he makes that breakthrough, the technique becomes much more popular. His publications are accepted in a larger number of in a larger number of medical journals. And very importantly, the Journal of the American Medical Association starts publishing approving positive articles about it. This is the early 1950s. But then there's a shift, and Delorme decides to move on to study other things, work on other things in medicine, and the technique kind of falls out of favor.
So even though he's an orthopedic surgeon or specialist, right?
And physical medicine was his specialty, but he worked in the orthopedic.
So he's publishing this work. It's acknowledged to be potentially transformational, but based on what you write, essentially in the 50s, it kind of falls off the radar for 40 years, basically.
That's right.
So the medical establishment, I hate to use the term, medical community, isn't really thinking of weight training, resistance training as part of a, I'm sure there's some doctors, but part of a recovery or a health regimen necessarily.
No, because they've got other things to think about.
Yeah.
There's a crisis in our culture of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, so they're thinking aerobics.
That's right. Running.
This is the 60s, the 70s, the rise of aerobic. We did, on How I Built This, we did the story of Jazzercise, and I interviewed the founders, an amazing story, because she really invented aerobics. And this is in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And so it's heart health. It's move your body, get your heart pumping.
Absolutely, that's right. So medicine is just, aerobics is taking up all the cultural oxygen in medicine. And it's not until the problem of the aging population really starts to come into view that medicine turns around and looks, and once they've got aerobics kind of under control, they've got cardiovascular health better, heart attacks are coming down, that they start to think a little more about weight training again.
Because in the 70s, I mean, and your book is endorsed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, we know about Muscle Beach, and I mean, Jack LaLanne, it goes back to the 50s, but it's the guys who are mostly men who are doing this kind of training are focused on their physical appearance.
That's right.
It's not, no one's talking about this as a health benefit or a health aspect. It's about getting jacked, right? And so, because you see old films and videos of literally of guys smoking cigarettes on weight benches doing, right? It's crazy. They have a cigarette in their mouth and they're doing, their bench presses,
Right.
And they're big guys, but that's sort of the culture, not the cigarettes, but that's the culture until we get to this woman who's a young medical doctor at Harvard and Tufts that you write about, Maria Fiatarone Singh. She's working in Boston. And tell us a little bit about her. What does she sort of discover?
Maria Fiatarone lands in a lab at Tufts where the people in charge are starting to decide that maybe the problems of aging are really problems of body composition. Maybe it all comes down to too much fat and too little muscle. They do a study of weight training at high intensity, 80% of 1RM for men in their 60s, which is radical.
So that's 80% of their maximum weight, one repetition.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So
three times.
And they're doing legs, arms, or everything, or
They're doing legs.
Legs. So you sit down, and they'd have you lift your do a curl, right? A leg curl, right? Once. That's it.
Well, I know the study that you're thinking of, and, we will get to that in just a second. But this study of the 60-year-olds is the breakthrough for seeing the potential of weight training for older people.
Okay.
It is a leg training program. I can't remember the exact exercises, but this leg training program in a couple or 3 months doubles the strength of the men's quadriceps, triples the strength of their hamstrings, and makes the muscles substantially bigger.
And they're just sorry to interrupt. They're looking at this to presumably to see if, because these are people in their 60s, they're not old, they're not old yet. They're looking at them just to imagine the potential for people who are even older, right? Because
no, they're not even thinking about that yet.
Okay.
They think because at this time it is an article of faith that anybody who's 50 really can't gain strength and muscle. Right. Well, can't gain muscle, and any strength they gain is attributed to a neural paradigm alone. So strength is a collaboration of the neurological system and the muscle system. Strength is a collaboration between nerve and muscle. But medicine believes that it's nerve that's totally in charge. Muscle has nothing to do with it, and muscle can't get bigger after you're about 50.
But this study challenges that.
So this study changes that. And it's that insight that then gives another doctor in the lab, Maria Fiatarone, the idea that maybe it would work for these older people too.
In old age homes, in senior.
That's right. Maria Fiatarone goes to Hebrew Rehabilitation Center for Aged. The nickname for the place was Hebrew Rehab. And she has a meeting with the old people, and she says, what do you want? I have to do an experiment here, and I want it to be something that's going to make your lives better. So, what is your goal? Do you want to live longer? And this old man raises his hand, and he says, I'm 95 years old. I've lived long enough. I don't need to live longer. All I need is to wake up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom and come back by myself. And Maria Fiatarone says, I think I can help you. So she starts a study that's one exercise. It's the knee extension. You sit here, you raise your knee, and you put it back down. That is all they do. 9 nursing home residents, 3 times a week, 3 sets of 8 repetitions at 80% of 1 repetition maximum. And after 8 weeks, the minimum strength gain is 61%. The maximum strength gain is 374%. Wow. And the average strength gain is 174%.
And these are from very few repetitions, but that are heavy.
That's right. That's right. And are progressing. Every week, I believe, they did another strength test and reset the weights to be sure that they were keeping up with the muscle's adaptive potential.
Wow.
So the practical outcomes were dramatic. There were a couple of people who used canes to walk around at the beginning of the study that didn't need their canes anymore.
It's amazing.
There was one person who couldn't stand up from a chair without pushing and now could just stand up. So
this is 1990.
This is 1990. And the paper is called High Intensity Strength Training in Nonagenarians, which still sounds like near future science fiction.
Yeah. And we'll get to this because it's still, we're still a long way to go in terms of implementing this systematically. But one of the things that is interesting is I recently had a discussion on stage. I went to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, and I did a whole panel summit with the AARP. And it was fascinating because I discovered, and many of you may know this, which is the one of the biggest and most costliest things for Medicare are falls. If a person in a senior home falls, it costs $50,000 to $80,000. That fracture is extremely expensive, and so if you can somehow mitigate it, and they're looking at technology, predictive technology that could predict when somebody's likely to fall. But what she's doing here, Maria's doing in 1990, essentially is a natural way of addressing that.
That's right. That's right. It's prevention.
Yeah.
She actually goes on to do a study of hip fracture, the falls patients. She spends a long time doing due diligence for this study, and she identifies 13 risk factors for falls. She comes up with a program that then will address whatever risk factors apply to a certain number of hip fracture patients who come through a hospital in Australia. High intensity strength training is a pillar of this 13-part intervention. And even though it's difficult, even though it's inefficient, it could not be more effective. It reduces the worst possible outcomes of falls within the first year of those fractures by 80%. It reduces the risk of going back into the nursing home or dying by more than 80%.
It's amazing. I don't want to. I mean, it's. We'll talk about this, but it's amazing that this is not widely practiced. I want to get to some questions because we've got a few questions here, and I want to get to a couple of them from our audience. Let's start with this one, which is how has bigger and more emphasis on conversations surrounding mental health played a role in our changing understanding of muscle? So the connection between mental health and strength.
The first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is the research on muscle and mental health. And this is also very recent, and this also really starts with Maria Fiataroni Singh and the man who became her husband, Nalin Singh. They met working on the first randomized control trial of high-intensity weight training as treatment for depression for older people. They had 30 people who they put through a full-body weight training program, 45 minutes, 3 times a week for 2 or 3 months. They very carefully assessed the depression, the experiences of depression, the depressive disease among this group, using one rating scale that was completed by a psychiatrist, one that was completed by the patients themselves, and one that was created just for geriatric patients. Nobody had ever assessed depression in an exercise study in a way that was so comprehensive. After this intervention, after the intervention, 60% of the people who had been lifting weights had a reduction of their depressive symptoms of 50% or more, which is the threshold for clinically meaningful response in a pharmaceutical trial of antidepressant drugs. And 14 of the 16 people no longer fit the diagnostic criteria for depression. 14 of the 16 people who lifted weights were no longer depressed. Now, in that and subsequent trials, it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
But it does work for about 75% of people. And it works as well as the best antidepressant drugs. It only works for high-intensity weight training, heavy weight training. It doesn't work for lightweight training. It works regardless of whether the person believes it will work. They asked the participants in the trial whether they thought this. So it's not a trick of the mind. It actually is a physiological response that's working on. The weights are working on depression the same way a drug would.
Yeah. You know, I know that working on this book for 8 years, you also went on a journey, and we've talked quite a bit about this. Your own regimen. I think you've gained 15 pounds of muscle in the last several years. I mean, you are a strong guy. Tell me a little bit about how all of this research changed the way you live your life.
Jan Todd, who was, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the strongest woman in the world for about 10 years, from the mid-'70s to the mid-1980s, and then became probably the preeminent scholar of the history of strength training. She says, you get to a point where lifting weights is just like brushing your teeth. Maria Fiataroni Singh says, it really is as important as anything else in your life that you do. And I think the main way it's changed my life is that's just true for me now. It has to come first. It's as basic to everything about how I want to live my life, both now and in the future, that I can't not do it. And if I'm going to do it, I have to eat in a certain way to support it. And so the time that I think a lot of people in the last 10 years have learned to spend on social media, I learned to spend in the kitchen.
Yeah. And do you do it in the morning? Do you train in the morning?
I train in the morning as much as I can, but I often...
sometimes it shifts.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, I think a lot of people would hear that and say, and I exercise every day as well. It's not always easy, but I think a lot of people would hear you talk about this and brushing your teeth and say, well, Michael's just a really disciplined guy. He's able to do this every day, and it sort of leads to this question, which is a lot of the older participants in the studies stopped the PRT training when the studies ended.
Right. So
how can that be addressed? I mean, I think it ties into this question. How do you keep people motivated, disciplined?
The research on what the research on the social factors that contribute to people starting or continuing a weight training regimen is remarkably light. But one of the consistent themes that I find in the best quality research about that, especially research about people who are less likely to think of themselves as muscular beings, older women, people with chronic diseases, indicates that social support is really key.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of factors
Working out with a buddy or a friend
or just having people in your life who recognize this as important and continually help you reframe your life with this at the center. It's basically when people have others in their lives who really care about whether they get to the gym, they go to the gym. And if they don't have others in their lives who are really supporting them in this, they don't go.
Yeah. I think just to sort of address that too, I think for some people, goals also, I mean, you're talking about progressive training, so goals work.
Right.
And if you don't mind me indulging you in this story, which is when I turned 48, I always lifted weights and always exercised every day, but I couldn't do a single pull-up. It's a different kind of muscle. I just couldn't do one. And I was kind of shocked. I could barely do a pull-up. And I said, by the time I'm 50, I want to be able to do 50 pull-ups, not all in a row, but within a reasonable amount of time. And I did it. When I turned 50 last year, in 6 minutes, I was able to do it. It was really cool. Progressively over 2 years, you go from 1, and then you do 2. And then by the end of a couple of weeks, you're doing 10, or not a couple of weeks, it took me longer than that. But it's really cool. It's just to have that kind of goal, Yeah. And it was cool. I was like 50 years old, and it took me probably about 6 minutes, maybe 7, if I'm being generous. But still, it was a big achievement. It took 2 years to really build up to that.
I feel like you just came out.
Yeah.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you. But it is really gratifying, to think that what the human body can do and how resilient it is and how quickly it, you talked about this sort of, it was an article of faith that we just cannot get stronger after a certain age, like 35 or something. Right. But we know that we can.
Yeah.
And that's exciting too, to know that you can always do it. You can decide to do it when you're 60 or 70, or like these non-Nigerians or non-Nigerians when they're in their 90s. It
is never too late, and there's always something that you can do. I love how these transformations also, they kind of seep into your life in a way that you communicate whether you realize it or not. At the beginning, when we were talking about my sort of going off and writing this book and our losing touch, we got in touch again because I heard you interview Tim Ferriss and talk about entrepreneurship and how for entrepreneurs, the experience of sales develops a sort of progressive resistance to rejection. Yeah. And he compared that progressive resistance to gym workouts, and you just jumped on it. And I thought, guy's been working out. So I wrote to you and told you about the book, and you said you had been.
It's really just remarkable to sort of see, especially when you don't necessarily think of yourself. I've never thought of myself as a muscle guy. I'm not. I'm lean. But to know that you can really train yourself to get stronger is pretty cool that we can all do that. I have a couple more questions. I want to try to combine them because they're somewhat connected, which is, this one is, it's about how, with all the distractions, right? Around us, social media and unhealthy food habits and stress, and how do we integrate this into our lives with so many competing commitments and noise? And tied to that, connected somewhat to that, is how does sort of technology change our relationship, AI in particular? You may not know, but how is it changing our relationship with exercise in our bodies?
Yeah, the AI, I'm going to have to punt. You
Yep.
probably know more about that.
But how do
than
we
I
integrate that into our lives? How do we, with all of the distractions and all the noise?
You just do?
You just have to. You just have to make a decision. You have to decide that it's like brushing your teeth. That it's not a choice. It's critical.
Yeah. I mean, Peter Attia has a great idea about the horsemen. We look ahead, we look at our family history, we look at our current state, and then we look ahead and we see what is likely to come get us. Is it diabetes? Is it dementia? Is it osteoporosis?
Disease, cancer.
And then
It's going to be one of those things.
And yeah. And then you reverse engineer
Yes.
the way that you're going to, nobody's going to win this race ultimately.
Yeah.
But
Improve your chances.
that's right. That's right. And then you build your regimen around that. I mean, if that's what it takes, like, and going back to the idea that muscle is a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
Then you begin to see your workouts as the way that you're going to get to go on vacation with your spouse when you're 90, the way that you're going to be able to play with your grandkids. The workouts start to stop happening just today. They're happening now and in the future.
Yeah.
And they're also happening in the past, and they're how we're outracing the past.
Yeah. And before we wrap, if you do start, and I hope you do, and I think a lot of you are already doing it, make sure to stretch your muscles too. Really important to stretch them. That is all the time we have left for today. Michael, thank you so much for being here in San Francisco with us. Thank you also to our audience here in person, online, for joining us tonight, for contributing your great questions. We thank you. It was an honor to be here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks so much. Good night.